Live intro in 3, 2, 1. In a world of celebrity apologists, we are a small-time voice, but we're making a big-time noise for the gospel of Christ. Bringing you the best Christian apologists you've never heard of, we are the Mentionables. Hello there, Mentioners. I'm Joel Furchess.
And I'm Chad Gross.
Today on the Mentionables, we experience pain and pleasure through some mechanism of biology. This is evidence against God. Or is it evidence for God? Think about that now. Also, the knee bone's connected to the leg bone. Or is it? First, though, David Wood, give us your best argument against Islam. Go.
I wasn't prepared to talk about Islam tonight, but I do want to recommend my Islamicize Me videos that I hear James White really likes.
I'm kidding. This is Chad Gross. They're indistinguishable, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Only by looks, I think.
Oh, well, Chad has his strengths too. Anyway, Chad, you went last time. How about you kick us off this time?
I actually was listening to a debate between Matt Dillahunty, who does the Atheist Experience, and with Mike Licona. And I was rather surprised, although maybe I shouldn't have been, but I was rather surprised that he threw out the old why doesn't God heal amputees objection. Yes. And I thought to myself, I don't know, Joel, I don't know about you, but I almost characterize sometimes too much maybe. In this case, when somebody brings up this argument, it kind of in my own mind, it puts them in a certain category of atheists.
Yeah.
Because
whenever I hear this objection, it almost inevitably comes from an atheist who used to be in a charismatic church environment with faith healing. And, an atheist's objections really say a lot about the Christian environment they came out of, because atheists tend to believe that all Christians believe whatever it is that their particular church believed when they were a Christian.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and that's absolutely been my experience as well. I recall once talking to an atheist, and he was really rallying against the idea of faith. And when we got into a conversation more and more, it became apparent that the definition of faith that he was taught was that faith is basically just believing, not because you have good evidence to trust, which is how we understand it, but meaning we just blindly believe. And when he would ask questions, people would tell him, well, you just have to have faith. And of course, he was asking the question, faith in what? But eventually he fell away, and it made a lot of sense in retrospect, of course, why he didn't like that word faith, because he had a very negative experience and not been taught what the Christian faith actually believes, what the Bible actually demonstrates biblical faith is. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
Well, now I'm experiencing the same symptom in reverse, because I figured all atheists had that definition of faith.
Oh, yeah, it does seem like that sometimes, but there are those atheists out there that will take us at our word and understand that faith is another way of saying trust or believing in something because you have good reason to. Of course, the Dawkins followers and such as that, and the new atheist types will not, regardless of how you define it. I remember reading some stuff from John Loftus, and he just continually put forth this definition of faith that I did personally not recognize, and he was actually criticizing other Christians because they didn't agree with that definition, or they tried to change the definition. And it was just comical because historically, that's what faith has always meant.
Yeah.
Trusting in what you have good reason to. This is not a new definition.
So I got into this exact conversation with an atheist one time, and of course, they come at me with this full presupposition of the definition of faith, and so I responded by saying, you and I probably share faith in a lot of similar things. For instance, I have faith that science and technology is going to continue to advance and address a lot of the, needs that we have as a society in certain areas of, say, communication and medicine and so forth. I have faith in my wife. I believe that she is going to be faithful to me. So there are things that I have faith, and I'm sure you have a wife, and that you're confident in her faith. You're faithful, or have faith in her fidelity and so forth. And he responds that, yeah, well, I know my wife. I've been with her for years, and I trust her. That's and I was like, exactly.
Yes,
yeah, you're getting it.
Yeah, that was great. I mean, him coming to the conclusion by himself, I mean, that's something that'll stick more than something that we say for sure. Mm-hmm. So if we return to the amputee argument, there's also a website, whywon'tgodhealamputees.com. And,
okay, which side are they coming from?
What do you think?
I'm guessing atheists.
Oh, yes. Yeah, Matt Dillahunty in the debate that I referenced actually recommended the website, which made me even sadder for Matt Dillahunty. It definitely knocked him down a few pegs as far as the type of atheist that I had previously categorized him as. And, of course, these aren't hard, fast categorizations, but whenever I hear somebody, I mean, I'm sure atheists, if there's any atheists listening, they probably have similar things where if a Christian brings up a certain argument, they think, oh my gosh, is this guy serious? and I'm just confessing right now to you and to the listeners that when I hear, why won't God heal an amputee, I don't consider that a very persuasive or weighty objection. But gotquestions.org, which is a really handy site for quick answers to these types of things, I really like the way they kind of summarize the argument. And so here's how they summarized it. It goes something like this. If God is all-powerful, and if Jesus promised to do anything we ask, or so the reasoning goes, then why won't God ever heal amputees when we pray for them? Why does God heal victims of cancer and diabetes, for example, yet he never causes an amputated limb to be regenerated? The fact that an amputee stays an amputee is proof to some that God does not exist, that prayer is useless, that so-called healings are coincidence, and that religion is a myth. Now, I want to demonstrate something, and that's the end of the quote. I want to demonstrate something that I did there. Notice that when I presented this objection, I presented a very robust version of it. In other words, I didn't try to water it down. I didn't try to make it more palatable. You know that word.
Palatable. You didn't straw man it, basically.
Exactly. I didn't that's what I was getting to. I didn't straw man this. I didn't straw man the argument. I represented it fairly and with as much teeth as it can have. And I think this is something that we need to make sure that we're doing as theists. Is if we're going to attack arguments, let's definitely attack the best versions of them, or good versions of them. And so that's kind of how
us to straw man anything that hurts us in the long run.
Exactly. And so I just think that's important to point out. So my first objection, my first problem with the objection here, it's making a huge assumption. The assumption is what? That God has never healed an amputee. Mm. But of course my question is how can one know with 100% certainty that God has never healed an amputee ever in human history? So the best we can do here is to say something like, why have I never seen God heal an amputee? Mm-hmm. Or perhaps we could say something like, why don't we have it on record that I know of that God's never healed an amputee? But then when one considers Scripture, which we argue elsewhere that you have good reason to believe Scripture, that it's been faithfully handed down, that it's very close to what was originally written. Even people like Bart Ehrman admit this. I would argue that we may in fact have positive evidence that God has healed amputees. For example, if you consider Mark 1:40 through 42 or Luke 17:12 through 14, when lepers are healed. If you know anything about leprosy, we can be relatively sure that some of those folks had most likely lost some fingers. Mm-hmm. But yet they are restored whole, we're told. Mm-hmm. Further, there's a man with a shriveled hand in Matthew 12.
That's the one I was thinking about.
Yeah, 9 through 13. Or Jesus healing Malchus when Peter severs his ear in Luke 22. Mm-hmm. And then finally, let us not forget that Jesus also raised the dead, which is a much grander miracle than healing an amputee.
Yeah.
So my first problem with the objection is that I think it makes a huge assumption, and the assumption is one that can't be known. What is that assumption? The assumption is God has never healed an amputee ever in all of human history. Mm-hmm. But in my mind, that's not possible to know that. Secondly, if we have good reason to believe that the New Testament is historically accurate, which of course we would argue that we do, then I think we have some positive reasons to believe that there have been some times that God healed amputees. Mm-hmm. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, getting back to the beginning of your section, I was thinking about this whole, why doesn't God heal amputees? It seems like a mic drop type argument for the atheist, like, why doesn't God heal amputees? Bam! You're an atheist. Like, who created God? That whole thing.
Yeah, it's what I call a bottle rocket argument. You know, the bottle rocket at the 4th of July, it's got you light it, and it's got the cool whistle, and then it's got the bang, and then of course it just fizzles out. And I think that's kind of where this type of argument is you first hear it, and it's got kind of an edginess to it, and it seems like it really packs a punch, but when you really look at it closely, it just fizzles out.
Yeah, and as far as the second part, I don't think that anybody presenting this argument even cares about what the Bible has to say about these things, because the person that they're approaching, the target audience for that objection, is, you know, these people who are very involved in this kind of faith healing movement, where, you know, one of the classic ones they do is extend a leg. You know, somebody walks up and one leg's a little longer than the others, and bam, they do it on stage, and then suddenly their leg extends, and now their legs are even, which probably is a hoax in at least several circumstances. And then, of course, you have the things that you're talking about, where it's cancer or diabetes, where, you know, sometimes these things are known to remiss. And so how can you tell that that was God that did it, or just, you know, one of these medical mysteries where it happened on its own? So they bring up the amputee thing not because they're interested in hearing a Bible verse about it. They're interested in showing the faith healing crowd that, you know, it would be very, very impressive act for an amputee to get up there and suddenly their arm reappears or grows back out of their body. And I imagine that if somebody making this objection were to hear the Bible verses, they'd be like, okay, so his hand was withered up and then it got big again. But his hand had been there the whole time. Could have been a hoax, you know, or bringing the dead back. That could be a hoax. You know, I could lie down and pretend to be dead and then get up. The amputee thing is clearly because of the impressiveness of that and how it would be a certainty. You know, you see that, there's really no way to hoax it, so bam, you've got evidence for God. Why wouldn't God? This is the classic thing. Why doesn't God give us more evidence? You know, and that would be a good example of, you know, if God had done that, that would be plenty of evidence. He could spell his name in the stars, or he could heal an amputee in front of television, and bam, there's a God.
Right, and you're reading my mail, man, because I'm getting there.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah. So first of all, as I said, we can't know for sure that God's never healed an amputee in human history. Secondly, it is possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for not healing amputees. And even if this is at very least possible, it doesn't actually have to be the case. It just actually has to be possible. This objection fails. And so, as philosopher J.P. Moreland has pointed out, he says this. He says, God maintains a delicate balance between keeping his existence sufficiently evident so people will know he's there, and yet hiding his presence enough so that people who want to choose to ignore him can do it. This way, their choice of destiny is really free. Mm-hmm. And so secondly, it is possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for not healing amputees. And possibly the reason is because, as Moreland says, he wants to maintain that delicate balance between being evident so that people who want to know he's there can know he's there, but also making his presence mysterious enough so that people who don't want to choose him can choose to ignore him. And so that would also be a point that I would want to make. What do you think of that one?
Yeah, no, I mean, the hiddenness of God has is I don't say it's a problem, but I don't think it's something that I have confidence in one particular argument or the other. Because what J.P. Moreland says is probably the case, but it seems like a weak argument if you're a skeptic, because it almost seems like an excuse. Yeah, God doesn't want to be too obvious, or else you just have to believe. And if I were a skeptic, I'd come back with, doesn't God want everyone to believe? Why would he give me the possibility of disbelief if he wants everybody to be saved? So,
right. Right, and once again, I would say that I'm getting there. Yeah, and but of course that boils down to, God wants everybody to freely choose him, right? And God ultimately can't make anyone freely choose him. And so God, as C.S. Lewis put it, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course, he can woo, he can draw, but ultimately God is a gentleman. He's not going to force his way in. And so I think that delicate balance makes a lot of sense, especially in light of the next point that I want to make. Even if God's never healed an amputee in any moment in human history, I think it's important to point out that it doesn't follow from that he doesn't exist. Right. So, for example, let's grant, okay, even though I argue you can't know this, but let's imagine, I'll grant you your argument that God has never, ever in human history healed an amputee. All that tells us is that God, for whatever reason, has never healed an amputee. It does not follow from that he doesn't exist, because here's why. One still needs to deal with the positive evidence that argues that he does exist. Examples of this would be the arguments from reason, the cosmological arguments, the teleological arguments, the moral argument, the argument from the information found in DNA, the historical evidence for the resurrection. So when we're faced with a question like, why won't God heal amputees? I'm able to reason from what I know about God from these arguments that I'm on good grounds for trusting that if God's never healed an amputee, he has morally sufficient reasons for doing so. And it's important to notice here that my reasoning here is based upon evidence that I have found convincing, not in spite of the lack of evidence.
Yeah.
So in other words, I certainly agree with the skeptic that the healing of an amputee could certainly count as evidence for God's existence. Absolutely. However, I see in no way how that evidence is necessary evidence for God's existence. So I think it's important to point out a few things in review. Number one, even if it's true that God's never healed an amputee, it doesn't follow from that he doesn't exist. That's a non sequitur. As I said earlier, it could be that he has morally sufficient reasons for not healing a amputee. Also, you still have to deal with these positive arguments, or what we would call a cumulative case of arguments that make the case that God does exist. Therefore, we're able to reason on good grounds that, okay, God doesn't heal amputees, but I've got all these other good reasons to believe he exists, so he must have morally sufficient reasons for doing so.
Yeah, so the question that I have to ask about this is, why should God heal amputees? Now, the atheist could come back with one of two arguments. One would be, well, to convince everybody that he exists. It's a sign of his existence. So he puts on a big show, and now, wow, God exists. Well, yes and no. I mean, here you have something that's convincing of a supernatural force, but you're not going to necessarily jump to the God of the Bible as the explanation for why that guy just grew his limb back. And I'm also going to argue here in a moment that there would still, and I'm going to present evidence for this, there would still be people, Joel, regardless of God. I think that we are foolish to believe that if God started healing amputees, that all of a sudden people would just start becoming Christians left and right. Yeah. I actually think that's very naive to believe that. I'm going to argue that in a little bit. But anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry. Well, yeah, and that's what I was about to say, was I have reason to believe that a skeptic would remain a skeptic even if they saw something like that happen. But here's the other thing is, if it served as a motivation for conversion, the motivation would be, hey, if I convert, God will fix all my problems. I can convert to get things out of God. It then serves as the wrong motivation to become a Christian. It's like when the mobs were following Jesus because he did a couple of miraculous feedings, and he said as much. He said, well, they're following me to get food now, essentially.
Right.
So,
right.
And again, the other thing is the story of Job, where Satan essentially tells God that the only reason that Job's so faithful to you is that you've given him wealth, and you've given him a great family, and you've given him health, and, you're the vending machine of the sky, essentially. At this point, he's following you to get stuff. That's one reason to believe, or to question why God ought to heal somebody, is that at this point, you're following God to get stuff out of him and to get a better life.
Yeah, I was just going to say that really ties into my next point really well.
I'll have to stop talking, man.
No. I love it when that happens, because that just was a great tie-in. I mean, basically what I was going to point out is that I'm inherently skeptical of these arguments that basically say, if God would do X, I would believe. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what this argument is, right? If God would heal an amputee, I would believe. And I believe these are misguided at best, because what do? And this is what you're hinting at, Joel, is they shift the responsibility back to God to prove himself to a person. Mm-hmm. However, should we have good reasons, which I pointed out prior, I believe we do, to believe the Christian God exists, one should look to the Bible for guidance about how to seek him, instead of demanding that he prove himself in a manner that pleases their own selfish desires. Mm-hmm. And so this is essentially saying, and this is what you were hinting at, I think, that it's all about me. Yeah. It's the Burger King mentality, right? I want it my way.
Yeah.
I want God to do X, Y, and Z, and only if God does X, Y, and Z will I believe in him. And I just think those types of objections are misguided.
Oh, yeah, and it's the easy path right to the Word of Faith movement. I mean, it's the first step towards that. And, at that point, the question becomes, well, if this guy got healed, why didn't I get healed for, whatever it is that I have that I want to get healed for? And, at that point, the question is, well, okay, so you got healed of this. I can 100% guarantee you that at some point in your future, you're going to have some other ailment afflict you. And eventually, it's going to get so bad that, hey, you're going to die, right? So,
right.
What do you do with that? Every single person that Jesus healed got sick again at some point in their life, and then everyone he brought back from the dead eventually died again.
Correct.
So,
correct.
What's the ultimate goal here? The ultimate goal is not to health, wealth, and prosperity. There's a higher goal in the sky, and that's the other question. Why ought God to heal an amputee? At this point, it's just because you want a flashy show from God. Not that you're concerned with the larger goal here, and the larger goal is the glorification of God. Guess what? That amputee is going to be resurrected at some point in the future, assuming God exists and the Bible is true, and they're probably going to have their arm back at that point. So, if you're looking for the healing of amputees, you're not looking at the big picture where they will be healed forever.
Well said. Well said. Yes. Lastly, in dealing with this objection, and I think that's a great point. Lastly, I would say that I think there's a huge false assumption being made here by the person who is assuming, if I would only see God heal an amputee, I would then believe. Mm-hmm. Let's imagine that an amputee prays to be healed, wakes up the next morning with their once missing arm fully intact. I could easily imagine those who would still search for a naturalistic explanation for how the limb returned, in spite of the evidence that a miracle occurred.
Oh, yeah.
Now, some people listening might be like, "Come on, Chad, that's a cop-out." Actually, no, and let me tell you why it's not. Let's look at Richard Dawkins, who's a great example. Consider an interview he had. This was with Dr. Peter Boghossian,
Mm-hmm.
And this is available on YouTube. And Bogosian starts out this interview, and he says this. He says this to Dawkins. What would it take for you to believe in God? And here's what Dawkins says. I used to say it would be very simple. It would be the second coming of Jesus, or a great big, deep, booming bass voice saying, I am God. But I am persuaded, mostly by Steve Zera, who is a regular contributor to my website. He more or less persuaded me that even if there was this booming voice in the second coming, with clouds of glory, the probable explanation is that it is hallucination or a conjuring trick by David Copperfield.
Yep.
He made the point that a supernatural explanation for anything is incoherent. It doesn't add up to an explanation for anything. A non-supernatural second coming could be aliens from outer space. So at this point in the interview, Bogosian, he begins to speak, and he's in full agreement with Dawkins. And he argues, he gives the example that if the stars spelled out a message from God, we would first have to rule out alternative explanations like an alien trickster culture.
Yep.
Dawkins then goes on and agrees with Bogosian. So Bogosian then asks him this question, kind of rewords the original question. So that, stars aligned into a message, couldn't be enough. So what would persuade you? Listen to this objection. Listen to what Dawkins says.
Uh-huh.
Well, I'm starting to think that nothing would, which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming.
That's Dawkins!
Yep.
Now, that to me, Joel, and I don't know if you have the same reaction I did when I read this, is shocking. Because here we have this objection, people like Matt Dillahunty, why won't God heal amputees? Why won't God, go to the website.
Yep.
And yet we have an interview between Bogosian and Dawkins, two prominent non-believers, and they both say that if the second coming of Jesus happened, or a great big deep booming bass voice said, I am God, that they still would not believe. And Dawkins, to his credit at least, is honest, and he says that nothing would convince him that God exists. And so if you go back to the point that I made, I think that they are making a false assumption, the people who think this objection is persuasive, when they actually think that if God did heal an amputee, that suddenly hordes of atheists would become believers in God. I actually don't believe that's the case. And I think the Bible gets it right here when it offers the suggestion that the objector is suppressing the truth, Romans 1:18.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because they don't want to be accountable. Because I'll be honest, those seem like hard words, but it seems to me that a moral objection or a moral reason for suppressing the truth makes a lot more sense than an intellectual one, when somebody is actually willing to go so far as to say, well, I would believe that an alien colony spelled out a message from God in the stars before I would be willing to entertain a theistic explanation.
Well, C.S. Lewis says something like there are two types of people, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those who resist God to the point where God says to them, thy will be done. And
yes.
This ties back to something that you see in Scripture, at least I do, where if somebody resists God long enough and hard enough, God actually gives them what they want. And so you see this in the New Testament at some point. I don't remember which book. It was one of Paul's epistles where he talks about these people that are resisting God, and then he says, and so God gave them up to a strong delusion. That isn't to say that God was deluding them so much as God stopped persuading them to the point that they were strongly deluded in their own delusion. You also see this in the monologue in the beginning of Proverbs, where wisdom is pleading and begging for people to pursue her, and at some point says something to the effect of, the foolish will eventually be given up to their foolishness, get no chance. And that may be the same thing that's coming into play in the book of Exodus with Pharaoh, where it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. But Pharaoh was the first one to harden the heart. So, you see God giving the person over. And I'm not surprised or shocked at all that Dawkins said what he did. I came to the same conclusion myself. I think it was with Lawrence Krauss on an Unbelievable interview where he did the old, God would have to spell it out into the stars to convince me type deal. And I thought about it for a while and came away with the conclusion that even if that had happened, the first thing he would do is put up a catalog of natural explanations for that and come to the conclusion that it was more likely that the natural explanation was true than that a God was real. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and even if it's the stars spelling
I'm stumped.
Yeah. Then it's the evidence, the conclusion is, hey, it's got to be natural, right? Can't be supernatural. So,
right. And the verse that you're actually referencing there is Romans 1:24. It says, "Therefore God delivered them over to the cravings of their hearts." And in the Apologetic Study Bible, the footnote there says, "Does God cause people to sin? At some point he may deliver them over to their sinful choices, giving them what they want.
Yep.
They abandon God's ways, and he abandons them, further intensifying their awful condition."
Yep. Nope, that's what I'm talking about.
Yep. And it says in verse 26 here as well that this is why God delivered them over to degrading passions. And so there you see it once again. And so lastly, I want to make the point when I laid out the objection. I made the point here that it said, I like this. This is why I used it. It says, if God is all-powerful and if Jesus promised to do anything we ask, and I heard you kind of, I don't know, you made some type of noise as if you caught that when I read it.
I did.
Yeah, and I think it's important, and it's just sufficient to say here that, of course, when Jesus was saying that if we prayed in his name, that we would have whatever we asked for, he was, of course, meaning that if we prayed according to God's will, that we would have. It did not mean, for example, that, obviously the reductio ad absurdum comes in handy here. I need a new car. Well, Jesus said that if I pray for anything in his name, then I'll get it. Lord, please give me a new car, and then it's sitting in the driveway the next morning. That's ridiculous, of course. That's not what it means. What it means here is when we pray, if we pray according to God's will, then our prayer will be answered. And so I just thought, for the listener who might get hung up on that, I wanted to make sure that I made that point.
Yeah, you really go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, you really have to look at how God handles his name throughout Scripture. I'm personally reminded of the 23rd Psalm, which is so famous. At some point, it says that he leads me on paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Why does he lead me on paths of righteousness? It's not for my benefit. It's for his name's sake. Why? Because my righteousness points to him, and this honors his name. And so God's name is God's character. God's name is God's essence. And so, when you pray in his name, what you're doing is praying in such a way that his name is glorified. It's to his name. And, if you study enough Scripture, especially the Old Testament, when Israel is kind of fluctuating back and forth between God and evil, the prophets come in with this whole thing that, because of my name, you have, and it always comes back to his name, which is essentially his reputation, his character, which is being called into question here. So, yeah, I think that comes into play in that particular statement. Right,
exactly. And so, where do we end up here? So, the question, of course, is that we started with is the fact that God has not healed an amputee is somehow proof that he does not exist. that he doesn't answer prayer, healings are coincidental, and of course that religion is a myth. That, in my mind, is a non sequitur when we think about the fact that how can anyone know that God's never healed an amputee in human history? Mm-hmm. It's also possible that God has morally sufficient reasons for not healing amputees. Even if God has never healed an amputee in human history, it still doesn't follow from that he doesn't exist. We've still got to deal with those positive arguments. So it's important to remember here kind of the takeaway is that healing of an amputee could certainly count as evidence for God's existence, but it is not necessary evidence for God's existence. Mm-hmm. Also, these types of arguments that say if God would do X, I would believe, as I argued, are misguided. If we have good reasons to believe the Christian God exists, then we should look to the Bible for guidance on how to seek him instead of demanding that he prove himself in a manner that pleases us and our own desires. Yeah. If the God of the Bible exists, it's about him, it's not about us. And then, of course, I think there's a huge false assumption being made here, and listeners, some listeners might have trouble getting their mind around this, but I think if they take some time to think about it, they'll see what I mean, is that the assumption is that if a skeptic saw an amputee healed, that, of course, all of a sudden they would become a Christian. And I think Dawkins and Bogosian are great examples of people who their objections, I think, go well beyond intellectual objections. Yep. And then finally, when we need to remember that when we're praying, we receive the things we pray for when we're praying in accordance with God's will. And of course, what Joel added on is when we're praying to glorify his name. And so I think that what we're left with here, I want to just end on saying this again, is a bottle rocket argument. You know, it starts out, it's got some panache, it's got some rhetorical power. Like Joel said, it's a mic drop. Of course, then it's got like a boom when you deliver it, but when you really unpack it, it really fizzles out, I think, and doesn't give us much other than maybe an internet meme.
Yeah, and it doesn't defeat any of the larger arguments for God's existence. It's just kind of a side issue at best.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so, and of course, one of the last things I want to say, and I just find this interesting, is that I've actually never met an amputee or read anything by an amputee who themselves has a real problem with this. Mm-hmm. And I just find that intriguing. You know, it's interesting from that perspective, of course. And I was thinking of, I know that there's a Christian author who was born with no arms and no legs. And he actually goes around and does motivational speaking. Yeah. So here he is, and I'm going to guess that he was born that way. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to guess that in some point in his life, he probably asked God to give him limbs or to heal him. And yet here he is going around and sharing the gospel with people. And so it really does boil down to, I think, what Joel said as well, that, it's either, are you coming at this that it's about you or it's about God?
I'm reminded of Johnny Erickson Tada when you're talking about that, because her ministry has been spectacular and has been going for decades, and she speaks and she writes books and she does art and so forth, and she's a quadriplegic. So that has been a benefit to God's kingdom, if anything, because it became a ministry after a stupid mistake she made when she was a kid.
Right, exactly. And I can only imagine the conversation she's had with the Lord, but yet here she is.
Yep.
Yeah. So it looks like, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, but the gentleman I mentioned, he's an Australian preacher and motivational speaker. Uh-huh. And his name is Nicholas James, and his last name is spelled Vujicic, if anybody wants to look him up.
Vujicic, maybe?
That's how I was going to say it, but then I thought I'd butcher it, so I thought, I'll just, let them look it up. But yeah, that's how I'd pronounce it, Vujicic.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, we're on the same page there. So.
Yeah. So All right, Joel, so you are going to take a kind of an interesting approach to actually an argument that I've heard against theism. And you're actually going to take this argument and argue in favor of theism. And of course, the argument I'm talking about is an argument that's been made popular by people like Paul Draper, who is a non-believing philosopher that I have respect for indeed. But you're going to talk about evolution and the biological role of pain. Is that correct?
Pain and pleasure.
Pain and pleasure. Pain and pleasure. I forgot the pleasure part. Sorry.
Yeah, and Draper's the one I'm drawing a lot of this from. But the amazing thing is that your section is going to tie right into my section. And we did not arrange this ahead of time, listeners.
We did not. The Lord just does that sometimes.
Yep. All right, my section. You know this, that the largest argument against the existence of God is the problem of evil. You're not going to find an atheist debating a Christian that doesn't bring that up. And I'm talking about water cooler conversations right up to William Lane Craig arguments.
Yeah, and I think it's such a fascinating argument in so many ways because it takes on so many forms.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things about the argument is if you're talking to someone about how do we best explain the fine-tuning or the origin of the universe, those issues are very impersonal in a lot of ways. But yet when we're talking about the problem of evil, a lot of times when somebody brings up a form of the problem of evil, in whatever form it may be, when they bring up the problem of suffering, many times there's a sufferer behind that when they bring it up. And so it has a lot of layers to it.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're alluding to here is the mind-body problem.
Actually, no. I didn't have anything in mind. I was just simply pointing out that when you say the problem of evil, that is such a vast, large topic, and it takes on so many different forms. For example, you said at the water cooler, and when you bring up the problem of evil, I'm thinking if I'm dealing with that at the water cooler, sometimes somebody might ask me, why does God let bad things happen to good people? But what they really might be asking me is, why is my grandma dying of cancer?
Yeah, okay, I get what you were saying now. In my mind, what you were saying is that behind the suffering, which is experienced by the body, there's a sufferer, which is the mind that relates to the suffering. The mind that is receiving the suffering through the body. I get what you were saying now. You're saying that the person making the argument is making it from a personal standpoint. They're not just making a broad statement like, I don't know, why doesn't God heal amputees? It would be more like the amputee saying that to you. Why doesn't God heal me?
Right, exactly. In my statement, when I said that many times when we're presented with the argument of suffering, there's a sufferer, it certainly applies in the way that you said it, absolutely. But I meant that we, just as Christians, need to keep in mind that many times the person might come across as very crass or angry or even, a little arrogant when they bring up something like this. But more often than not, they're actually suffering.
Yeah.
And they're trying to make sense of it. And so I just thought that was kind of a general point to bring up there. But it absolutely can mean the mind-body problem as well. Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, so one subset, as you're mentioning that there's so much involved in the problem of evil that you could write a whole book on it. But
you should do that, Joel.
I should. But one subset of the PO, as referred to by people in the know, is the problem of biological pain. But tied into that is also biological pleasure. And this is Paul Draper's argument. He doesn't just center on the biological pain, he also brings up the biological pleasure. Now, okay, a thumbnail sketch of that would be that our experience of pain and pleasure are entirely explainable through biological mechanisms. And as a result of functions such as the body responding to damage or the need for sustenance and reproduction. Now, Ben Watkins brought this up in his debate with Tyler, right, Chad?
Yes, I had a pretty good seat for that debate, actually.
Me too. Well, you had a better seat than me. By far.
Yeah, I did.
I was at the back of the room, but hey, I wasn't looking at it on YouTube, so there's that. All right, so I'm going to talk about Draper's argument, and he essentially examines the physical sensation of pain and pleasure in organisms to see which hypothesis of the universe better explains these findings. The two options are a godless, indifferent universe, which was the essence of Ben's argument, or a universe which is ordered by a personal creator. So this actually ties deeply into Tyler and Ben's debate.
Yeah, and I think it's important to bring out here too that how you just explained that was really, really well done, because that's how Draper argues, very probabilistically. So Draper argues in a way that says, okay, we've got this set of facts. Does this set of facts make more sense on theism or non-theism, or more cashed out is how you explained it. So that's a great segue into his argument.
Yeah. So he has a 3-point observation on that. He says that moral agents experience pain and pleasure known to be biologically useful, first off. Secondly, that sentient beings, that would be us, human beings,
right,
they're not moral agents. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's wrong. Sentient beings, he's referring to high-level animals, like dogs and monkeys. They experience pain or pleasure that we know to be biologically useful. So we know that animals are experiencing biologically useful pain and pleasure, and that then we also know that that everyone, including us, experience pain and pleasure that we do not know to be biologically useful. So it's kind of a complex argument, even though it's 3 points. But some of the basic ideas that he draws out are, firstly, that pain and pleasure are potent sensations. Pain doesn't just inform an organism that it's in physical danger. Like you often say, hey, you put your hand on a burning thing, you get pain to tell you to take it off, right?
Sure.
But it's also uncomfortable and even gratuitous. It's not just pain, it's suffering at times. Once you've pulled your hand off that hot plate with third-degree burns, you're going to be feeling that burn for the rest of your life. So why the suffering if it's just to inform you of possible damage? So organisms do not merely experience an avoidance reaction to injury, they suffer. Likewise, pleasure is biologically compelling and can be addictive, habit-forming, which is, not helpful. So these sensations make sense on the assumption that they evolved out of their usefulness to compel organisms to avoid danger and seek experiences that make them thrive. In an indifferent universe, the experience of pain could be merely informative, or it could be excruciating, and serve the same function. However, in an ordered, created universe, this universe could, according to Draper, be organized in such a way that the body could alert the neural system of physical peril without the associated suffering. So it's this idea of why would God build in the suffering if the only function was to inform you of possible danger. And then pain and pleasure are not related to moral behavior. So like a rapist experiences pleasure and his victim experiences pain. In a karmic system, it should be the other way around, right? Because you've got the innocent who's suffering in the evil act, and the victimizer, the evil person doing the evil act, who's getting rewarded for it. So this is the kind of thing you would expect in a different universe, but it would be surprising in the context of a universe under divine supervision. So another point is that moral agents, being human beings, appear to experience pain identical to that experienced by creatures which have no moral agency. So humans and animals experience pain in the same way. Once again, this lack of a differentiation between human and animals is exactly what you'd expect in an indifferent universe ruled by blind forces. But it's surprising if one allows for God. So that's boiling down the argument from Draper. Now, you might make the argument that this pain and pleasure is some part of the design, right? After all, if it's biologically useful, it doesn't need to be connected to any kind of morality, even if designed. serving a biologically useful end might be by design, leaving morality in its own separate realm. And this is where Draper's final observation comes in. There are examples of pain and pleasure which have no obvious biological end, which, again, it fights against the idea of a designed universe. So you might include things like pleasure through addictive substances, for instance. That's counter-indicated if it was meant to be helpful. Or, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, somatization disorder, which is this chronic condition where you would experience physical symptoms that involve more than one part of the body that are just pain. But there's no physical cause for the pain. You're just experiencing pain that's pointless. Otherwise, you're perfectly healthy. You're just in pain all the time. So these, quote, accidents of biology seem fairly sloppy if they're in a designed universe, but might easily be explained by the rough and unguided forces of evolutionary biology. All right.
Okay. Well, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Real quick?
Yeah.
I thought that was a very good summation of the argument, but I guess a question, and this is maybe, I haven't visited Draper's argument in a while, so forgive me if this is an obvious question, but just for clarification, you said pain and pleasure have no obvious end. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and when I say obvious end, I mean in terms of design. You could see why they evolved. You couldn't see a way in which they were designed, essentially.
Okay, so I guess that's my question then. I just wanted to make sure I had that right. So for Draper's argument to be successful, then it's important to the argument that pain and pleasure have no obvious end. Is that correct? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's all I needed to know. Continue, sir.
Okay.
I might revisit that, but I just wanted to make sure before you continued that I was with you. All right, go ahead.
All right. Well, I may have misspoke there. I see what you're getting at, and what Draper's essentially saying is that, yes, you can see the evolutionary origin of them, because pain is damage avoidance, and pleasure, the most obvious example of pleasure would, of course, be sexual pleasure, which is enticing for reproduction. It's useful for reproduction. So yeah, they have ends which are obvious in terms of what they do. What he's saying, I think, is that because they're sloppy, essentially, there's no separation on morality, as I've given examples, and also you can experience pain and pleasure which have no obvious end, like the somatization disease that I was mentioning, or self-stimulation.
Okay, right. I got you. Yeah, right. And hey, I just had a great idea. Whenever someone says mentioning on the Mentionables podcast, we should yell like they used to do on Pee Wee's Playhouse.
No, I like the fact that we have sub-listeners.
Yes. Okay. Never mind then.
I'll build it a sound effect after in post-production. How about that?
Today's secret word is mention.
That sounds good. Thank you, Cowboy Curtis.
I've got this great sound effect for every time somebody mentions Dawkins.
Well, that's Dawkins.
So...
I love it.
All right. So bottom line is that Draper lays out what, on the face of it, seems like a fairly compelling argument that the biological experience of pain and pleasure are exactly what you'd expect in a mindless, amoral universe, and not what you would expect in an ordered universe with an underlying moral law. Now, I think the underlying moral law is key here because, otherwise you could just circle around to the argument from design, intelligent design, for instance. This would be a good argument against intelligent design because some of this doesn't seem that intelligent, like somatization disorder, or the fact that we can easily become addicted to various substances that are not helpful to our body. Why wouldn't our body experience pain when it is, associated or subjected to some kind of unhealthy chemical, instead of experiencing pleasure, which would entice you to continue to take the unhealthy chemical, which would destroy your body over time. Right? So that wouldn't make sense on a designed universe. So, yeah, I mean, you could see the logic of it.
I think prima facie, it is. I agree with you. It's a good argument. But I also think that, once you start to unpack it, there's a little more to it. But yeah, I agree. Prima facie, it's compelling.
All right. So there are a couple of broader facts that Draper ignores or didn't realize, and they tend to shift the evidence back in favor of theism. And that's what I like about this argument, is you can really pull out some things. I'll get into it. You'll see where I'm going. The first thing that I wanted to address was the qualitative difference in the way in which animals and humans experience pain and suffering, as well as pleasure. Now, I'll start by saying let's use animals as a baseline for biological pain and pleasure, and then show the differentiation that humans have from animals. All right, so humans and higher-ordered animals experience pain and suffering, which evidence suggests is neurologically identical. Also, animals and humans generally seek to avoid or eliminate experience of pain and to pursue experiences of pleasure. We've established that. But here's the crucial difference. There's a very surprising way that humans will act against their biological pain and pleasure that you never see in animals. So I've mentioned this addiction thing a lot. Let's talk about that for a sec. Do an addiction study on a rat or a monkey. Asterisks, don't actually do an addiction study on a rat or a monkey. They're adorable. I continue. Give a rat some habit-forming substance, and he'll keep hitting that little button to get his fix until he dies. And teach a monkey to smoke, and that sucker's going to die of lung cancer. Now you give a human the same thing, and he'll get hooked in the exact same way the animal will, biologically. There's no difference biologically between the addiction of the animal and of the human. But here's the thing. Eventually, every single addict is going to admit that there's something wrong with being addicted. They may never do anything about it, but they at least feel like they've gone and done something wrong with their lives. Now, here's the...
Yeah,
I
was just going to...
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to add there, Joel, that my experience, as I think I've mentioned on a prior podcast, that I speak at a local mission, and of course have had many discussions with people who have fallen into various addictions, and just, kind of empirically, I can definitely agree with that even those who are continuing in it, even as something as simple, well, I don't know how simple it is, but I guess as certainly not one of the hard drugs, but even something as simple as smoking, most people that smoke will tell you that this is less than the best thing to be doing for their bodies, but yet they'll continue to do it. But you're right, regardless if they're going to do anything about it, I definitely can see what you're saying, that they know that it's not the right choice.
Yeah, and I mean, you'll even see this in the ones that refuse to admit that. They start making excuses. And making an excuse is essentially saying that you were wrong about something.
Correct. All
right, so the question we got to ask is, how is this sense of wrongness of the act biologically motivated if we're in an undesigned universe? I suppose you could make the argument that it is survival-oriented, right? So the body is busy responding to the pleasure sensation of the addicted act or substance. But here's the really unusual thing. Humans can actually fight their addictions. Not all of them, and not always successfully, but the mere fact that even some are successful is very difficult to explain on a biological model of pain and pleasure. How can pure biology explain this instinct to fight addiction and the occasional success? If we use animals as a baseline, no such mechanism exists. So where does it come from in humans? How do humans have the instinct, much less the ability, to struggle against and occasionally beat their biology? That can't also come from biology, because that means the body is at war with itself. You were going to say?
No, I was I was making the noise in order to say that is an interesting point.
Things that make you go,
Exactly. That's what it was.
All right. Well, sure. Okay. So you think about the fact that we have this expression that you were able to break your addiction with sheer willpower. And think about that. Willpower. Where does that come from, biologically speaking? All right. What do you think, Chad?
No, I think that I'm sitting here and I'm putting my atheist hat on, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say that, and again, I'm not saying I find this persuasive. You're asking me, what do I think? And I'm trying to come at it from that perspective.
Okay.
I guess I would say something like the ability to fight my addiction, we've learned evolutionary that it's better to not be addicted to certain things. And so that's just evolution helping me to work against something that is hindering my survival.
Yeah. And so what you're talking to me about is this capacity to learn and then to use your mind to tell you what you ought to be doing with your body. And you've got a mind body.
I think you chose some words there very carefully. Anyway, go ahead. That was funny.
Yeah. So this is what my argument boils down to, is this mind-body separation. Your body wants to do one thing, and your mind wants to do another, and your mind is fighting your body. If your mind is your body, we've talked about this, if your brain produces consciousness instead of receives it, then it makes very little sense, because the pleasure that you're feeling is in your neurons, in your brain. It's your brain that is producing the sensation of pleasure in the addictive substances. So at the same time you're experiencing pleasure with this organ, the organ is also saying, I shouldn't be doing this. So, there you go. Next, let's talk about marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today.
Nice quote.
Thank you. Most quotable movie ever, I maintain.
I go with Ghostbusters.
All right. We can have that competition later. You're wrong, and I'm right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I think I have a deductive argument, but anyway, we'll talk about that later.
All right. So, some facts. Only 3 to 5% of all mammalian species are socially monogamous. So this puts humans in a pretty exclusive club. However, the truly defining difference is that the vast range of sexual behaviors of humans around the globe. So sexual pleasure is arguably the strongest behavioral motivator as it relates to pleasure in people. So much so that you have large amounts of money and resources in both private and public sectors that are devoted to separating the act of sex from its biological purpose of procreation. The actual feeling that comes with sex has transcended biology at this point. Mm-hmm. So clearly the temptation to sexual promiscuity is strongly ingrained in human biology. And yet many humans opt to assert abstract values of loyalty and fidelity above the urge to pursue pleasure. So again, you have this mind-body separation. More telling, however, is that neither fidelity nor infidelity are universal human behaviors. Whereas with all other mammals, the entire species tends to follow one path or the other. Only in humans do behaviors vary so widely. Based on behavior alone, if humans were purely biological creatures, they would most likely fall into the breed of mammals that are not socially monogamous. And yet, some humans fight their biological proclivities by placing abstract values above physical drives. So, are humans monogamous by nature, or are they promiscuous by nature, Chad? Biologically speaking.
Oh, biologically speaking? Oh, promiscuous.
There you go. So if we are pure biology, and our consciousness is produced by our brains, this physical organ, then why are we occasionally monogamous?
Why indeed.
All right, let's talk pain, because I like to save the best for last.
Wow, you have a really weird sense of best. But anyway, continue.
All right, so the human experience of pain and pleasure are not always correlated with feelings of personal fulfillment. I'll explain. On a purely biological model, you'd expect that there would be a fairly straightforward link between chronic pain or physical disabilities and a depressed sense of mind. You know, if the mind follows the body, then when the body is in pain, the mind is in pain, and it's going to be less functional as a result. You'd also expect a similar link between biological pleasure, which we've talked about, as with frequent sexual experiences, and happiness or contentment. So if we're pursuing pleasure and seeking to eliminate pain, then our mind operates better in conditions of pleasure than it would in pain. Or so you would think. I mean, with animals it does. You can see animals actually try to commit suicide if they're in chronic pain. They don't function as well. So again, use animals as a baseline to see what a purely biological model would be like. All right. Studies suggest that this is not nearly as straightforward as it would seem. All right. Time to hit you with the research, sucker.
Bring it.
I took a look at the 1985 paper by Romano and Turner titled Chronic Pain and Depression, does the evidence support a relationship? ? All right, here's a quote from the paper. It says, the extent to which depression and chronic pain are associated remains a controversial issue that empirical studies have failed to resolve completely. End quote. Then the paper goes on to state that while there does seem to be a relationship between the two, that relationship is not as strong nor as straightforward as it might seem. All right, so in a study conducted by Indiana University, and the person who conducted it was Pratik Kini. Pratik, I don't know if that was a dude or a chick, studied people suffering from anxiety and depression. And they were asked to write thank you letters to various people in their lives. At the end of the study, all of the people who participated in writing the letters experienced a long-term improvement of mental health and lingering feelings of gratitude. And long-term means years. Out of this one study where they were told to write thank you letters. Beyond this, many studies have found that certain kinds of religious beliefs and practices can serve as an effective coping mechanism for people with chronic pain. For instance, a 2005 study conducted by the University of California showed that people with neuromuscular disease had much higher rates of gratitude when they were religiously active. Another study in 2004 found that people suffering from rheumatoid arthritis who offered prayers of thanksgiving were much less likely to be experiencing depression and anxiety, and much more likely to be experiencing feelings of hope. Now here's a really surprising find. There's a book titled Premarital Sex in America, filled with research by a couple of guys whose last names are Regnerus and Euchre. And they found that promiscuous behavior with a high frequency of sexual experiences can actually be a contributor to depression. So, in brief, you've got conditions under which people in chronic pain who are suffering all the time, amputees, are experiencing...
Are you okay, Joel? Do you have a cold?
I might have to take something after the podcast.
Oh, okay. All right.
Anyway, we've got conditions under which they're actually in a better state of mind than people who are having sex all the time. So what's it boil down to? Healthy humans who live indulgent lifestyles in which they're consistently undergoing experiences that give them liberal doses of adrenaline and endorphins can still be depressed and unfulfilled. On the other hand, people who have disabilities or medical conditions in which they experience chronic pain can be content and fulfilled. So this becomes obvious if you consider Hollywood. Here we have a bunch of wealthy, influential, and attractive people, but they're constantly airing their personal problems in the media and flitting between relationships. Very unstable people. also the people with the access to most resources for comfort and pleasure and self-esteem and so forth. And then you have a bunch of blue-collar workers who manage to find purpose and fulfillment in stressful and underappreciated jobs, such as healthcare, therapy, and missionary work. All right, Chad, I always ask you this, and you never know. Do you know psychologist Abraham Maslow?
Abraham Maslow.
Maslow.
No, I do not.
All right. Have you ever heard of Maslow's hierarchy of human needs?
Yes.
Okay. Then you know Abraham Maslow. By his
All right. Indeed.
All right. Well, yeah, you know it. It's well known. Most people have heard of it. But every time I ask, if you've heard of a famous behavioral psychologist, you tell me you don't know what I'm talking about, which is why I assumed you wouldn't know. Sorry about underestimating it.
And hey, I'm going to confess that is not an area of expertise for me.
Fair enough. All right, Maslow. He tells us that human beings begin with a very basic set of needs that they pursue in order to live. These include things like hunger, thirst, and physical comfort. Once these immediate needs are met, they pursue more long-term needs, such as safety and security. Then the third tier, he says that people would then pursue love and belonging. So relational stability, basically. And then the fourth level, once they've got that, is pursuit of respect and accomplishment. And then the highest tier would be things like transcendence, abstracts like philosophy, knowledge, and wisdom. That's the last thing. Once you've built up to that, to all the other levels, once you finally got the respect and accomplishments, then you fall onto transcendent pursuits. So here's the thing. You got a lot of people in these studies that I've shown that are skipping the middle and going straight to the end of the chart. The fact that people can quickly transcend the desire for basic physical fulfillment and continue to pursue higher abstract fulfillment tells you a lot. And I'm referring specifically to the people who are have chronic conditions and debilitations, and they're, saying prayers of thanksgiving or attending church and doing regular religious activities, and they're more fulfilled than the people running around having lots of sex and, drugs and pleasure and rock and roll and so forth. So that's pretty much where religion would land in that final tier, right, Chad?
Correct.
All right. So there you go. At the end of the rainbow of human needs sits the transcendent. That's the final goal. So what do we have? If we use animals as a baseline against which to compare the human experience, it becomes pretty obvious that animals are very much slaves to their biological experiences of pain and pleasure, whereas humans have an entirely separate dimension of experience that ascends to the level of the transcendent. Moreover, this transcendent experience would seem to have strong moral ramifications, right, Chad?
Indeed.
Okay. So maybe all of this transcendent stuff has some kind of biological or neurological explanation. I don't believe that, but let's leave that possibility on the table. Nevertheless, the fact that it exists at all, and that it exists in tension to mere pain and pleasure, kind of indicates a higher moral design, right, Chad?
Yeah, that's actually what I've been thinking, is that I like how you're arguing that essentially pain and pleasure make more sense actually on theism, which is design, which is quite a rejoinder to Draper's argument. Yeah,
these are, he didn't take into account the behavioral aspects of this. He just took into account the biological experiential aspects. So once you look at the behavior of humans versus animals, you start to see a lot of contradiction between what they're feeling and what they're doing.
Right.
And this all makes more sense on a theistic universe rather than an indifferent universe. At least I believe. All right, so what are we left with? What you start to see when you look at this dichotomy, some people pursue addictive substances, others resist them. Some people are monogamous, others are promiscuous. Some people experience depression and a lack of fulfillment despite their biological pleasure. And then others experience fulfillment and contentment in spite of their biological pain. So now, dichotomy, which is what we're looking at here, is the hallmark of morality. You've got right and wrong, good and evil, sin and righteousness. This is the language of moral theory, no matter what your philosophy is. And this dichotomy strains against physical experience in a way which is surprising on the model of an indifferent universe. So that's what I've got, Chad. This is another discussion I'd love to have with Ben.
Yeah, I would agree. I would love to hear his thoughts on that, because it definitely seems to challenge the argument, Draper's argument, and I think puts a theistic spin on it that is very, very thought-provoking.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what I was wishing that I could have jumped up and started arguing with him during the debate, because he was making all of these points that were coming from Draper. I don't know if he intentionally borrowed from Draper or if that was just coincidental, but, I had developed this argument a while ago, and I've been interested in trying to debate it with somebody. So the fact that he was actually hitting every point on this argument was a little saddening to me that I couldn't participate.
Well, I would recommend then, what I would do is I would just send it over to him and see what he thinks of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be an interesting discussion to have.
You see if he would want to do something on it, because he seems more than willing to interact on projects like that.
Yeah.
So
it's a thought.
Yep.
He's our go-to atheist. He's
exactly.
The vegetables pet atheist. Ben, if you're listening, I'm sorry I said that. Sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, Ben, that was him, not me. That was not Chet. Okay. just saying. Okay. Yeah, I definitely, like I said, I think it's a definite. It's definitely a interesting take on the argument, and I think you're right. I think you can definitely make a good case that Draper's overlooked some key distinctions there, and when it comes to behavior.
Yeah, and I don't think it's coincidental that we have animals as a perfect example of what purely biological machines would look like, and then we have humans, so we have something to compare behaviorally. And you get this argument that there's essentially no difference between humans and animals, which is largely an atheist argument. It's no surprise to me that a lot of atheists tend to be animal rights activists, because once you go down that route, then yeah, there's really no difference between animals and humans. But animals do serve as a very strong indicator that humans are different somehow. And that's kind of been intuitively obvious to people up until the modern era.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. I mean, for me, I know I've brought out this point before, but again, just one of the biggest differences for me is just that metacognition, that we can kind of think about our own thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me is enough to say, okay, there's something different here.
Yeah.
But I agree with you 100% that if you're going to be consistent and be someone who believes that we all come from a common ancestor and that we are all, and there's no God, and we're in a godless universe, then yeah, to be consistent, I mean, the dog is no more important or less important than you or I.
Yeah. So just to that point for a second, my sympathies lie in the direction of against evolution, but I'm not going to count evolutionary theory out. As you say, it's something I hold with an open palm. So, if someone were to convince me 100% that we share a common ancestor, that wouldn't destroy my Christianity, because, I would still believe that there's something different about humans. How that came about, who's to say? But that it is so is a different matter.
Yeah, and I think you bring out a good point about evolution. That I think in some sense we as Christians have made that much more grand and powerful than it really is. I am I'm not persuaded that evolution occurred on what would be a macro scale at this point. Mm-hmm. But I'm certainly open to the evidence. And if I became convinced of that, it wouldn't do anything to shake my faith.
Yeah.
Evidence of that, of course, is the biologos people, who I have a lot of misgivings and disagreements with them. But I also know that they are believers in Christ and brothers and sisters, and they have no problem with reconciling the two.
Yeah.
And so it is not in any way a defeater for to Christianity, in my view.
Yeah. And the money quote from C.S. Lewis on this is that a slow miracle is still a miracle.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Lewis is, you were talking about the most quotable movie. He may be the most quotable apologist of all time.
Definitely.
And, so.
All right, well, unless you have something to add, that more or less wraps up this episode.
Well, I was thinking with that Lewis quote,
mm-hmm.
With the long miracle. Do you remember? And I know he's done it elsewhere, but do you remember that how William Lane Craig deals with the objection of evolution in debates? Have you ever heard that?
The only thing I've ever heard him say about it was that, Christians tend to take too strong of a stand on that matter. So he seemed to be he seemed to be very vague about his impressions, and I think that was intentional, at least when I heard it, that he's not taking a stand on that issue.
Yeah, well, I'll say two things on that. First of all, what's really interesting is he debated Francisco Ayala, who is a famed evolutionary thinker and a decorated scientist. And I even read atheist reviews that basically agree that Craig pretty much mopped the floor with him. And Craig was very clear in that debate that he was open to evidence for evolution on a macro level. He just hadn't seen it. And here we have Francisco Ayala, this decorated scientist, who had this guy saying, "Hey, I'm open to this evidence. I just like to see it," and he couldn't produce it. And so that was interesting. But I remember when Craig was debating Hitchens at Biola. Mm-hmm. You'll remember that famous debate, and Hitchens brought up evolution, and Craig said this, and keep this in mind when you're talking about a slow miracle is still a miracle. He says this, he's referencing a book. He says, Barlow and Tipler, two physicists, in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, list 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and incinerated the Earth. And they calculate the probability of the evolution of the human genome to be somewhere between 4 to the negative 180 power to the 110,000th power and 4 to the negative 360th power to the 110,000th power. So, if evolution did occur on this planet, it was literally a miracle and therefore evidence for the existence of God.
Yeah. And we were talking about in our previous episode this idea that, the universe may be populated with alien beings, and that's why I tend to believe that it's not, because the biogenesis, or abiogenesis, I suppose, is so highly improbable that it's just impossible to imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all for me, Mr. Furches.
Okay. Well, looks like this episode is over. As always, check out our website, thementionables.org, where you can find articles written by the M's and resources also written by the M's. There are new articles hitting the site every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Consider hitting the donation button while you're there. This is something new we're doing, and it's a little embarrassing, but we're working to put together another conference, and that's where the money would go. And of course, conferences mean content, so listeners benefit as well. Check out our signature project, the Mentionables Project, where 5 of us got together and answered 40-ish atheist questions. That's available on Amazon Kindle for $3, and also through the website for a book copy, by which I mean a physical copy. Check out our YouTube channel. We're producing weekly episodes of Mentionables TV. There's some good stuff there. We call it MTV. Think it'll catch on?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Finally, follow us on Facebook, where every single thing we do is updated daily. We're also doing a weekly live show through our Facebook feed, where listeners can interact with us in real time. That's our show. Keep on mentioning all.